Hi, my name's Steve Burton. I'm one of the lead criminal defense attorneys at Intermountain Legal. I would like to answer the question, what are the penalties for domestic violence in Utah? Now, there's kind of two parts to the answer. The first part is, what is the penalty for the underlying charge? So let me explain that a little bit. In Utah, domestic violence is basically any crime against someone else that involves a cohabitant or somebody that you've ever lived with. So if you're charged with domestic violence, usually it will be some other charge classified as domestic violence, like domestic violence assault or domestic violence criminal mischief, something like that. So in response to the first part of that question, what are the penalties for domestic violence? The answer is it depends on what the underlying charge is. So if it's a Class B misdemeanor assault, then the penalties would be the same for what a Class B misdemeanor assault is, plus any extra required consequences for domestic violence. So the second question is, what are the extra requirements or consequences if the underlying charge is classified as domestic violence? And the answer to that is, if you're convicted of domestic violence, certain minimum mandatory consequences or requirements come into play. The first most prominent one is, if you're convicted, you must take a minimum of 16 weeks of domestic violence counseling or domestic violence classes. So even if it's a very minor charge, something like disorderly conduct domestic violence, even though the underlying penalty for the disorderly conduct can just be a couple $100 fine or something, if it's classified as domestic violence, then you automatically have to take a minimum of 16 weeks of domestic violence classes, and it could be more depending on what your domestic violence counselor says you have to do. So the first extra thing is domestic violence counseling or domestic violence classes. The second thing is, if you're convicted of domestic violence, there's a federal law that says that you cannot possess a firearm. So again, even if it's a very minor charge, something like interruption of a communication device, which usually means taking away somebody's phone, or disorderly conduct, or destruction of property, if you're convicted and it's classified as domestic violence, you lose your gun rights as long as that domestic violence conviction is on your record. So it can be a very, very severe consequence, and it can last a very long time. The third major consequence of having a domestic violence conviction is that it restricts some of your travel to other countries. For example, Canada will consider domestic violence charges similar to felonies. So if you have a domestic violence conviction, it may stop you from traveling to Canada. There are also other countries that may restrict your travel to that country if you have a domestic violence conviction. The last major consequence of having a domestic violence charge is on your background checks. Things like background checks for your employment, or for promotions, or for volunteer opportunities, or for apartments or places to live. If they do a background check and you've been convicted, they will be able to see that you committed a domestic violence offense, and they will consider you a convicted domestic violence perpetrator, which can obviously hurt you for a long, long time in any work situation or volunteer situation that you would like to go for. So if you can avoid domestic violence convictions, if somehow you can get that that classification removed, then it is very important to do so you don't incur those additional consequences. If you'd like to find out more about how you may be able to do that, please give us a call.